Okay, sweet. So week 3, we're going to cover components and composition, as well as a couple other important topics that have to do with alignment of different elements and basically how to really create like a smoother workflow and like a visual rhythm to how you approach incoming like design projects and different assignments you guys are going to work on in this class. So this is a basic rundown. We'll go over components, switch over to variants, and then we'll go over other useful tools, grids and guides, constraints, composition and spacing, and ideation and wireframing. It is a lot. So if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And here's the attendance form for this week, as well as the lecture file to follow along with. And we'll be doing a demo of components as well as variants. So if you'd like to follow along with that, I highly recommend. Sweet. So the first part of lecture, arguably the most important, going over components, which are reusable element systems throughout your designs. It's doing the weird thing again. Oh, God. Okay, so how do components work? Basically, to run down component, to put it simply, it's a reusable element you're going to use in your design files and your design systems. You could think about when you're, for example, designing an app interface in Figma, if you find yourself reusing the same element many times, it gets pretty exhausting to keep copying and pasting or adjusting the same style of design. So this is where components come into play and when they're really helpful. So you have two types of, you have a main component and you have an instance. And basically what this is the main component defines the properties of a component. You could define them through shape and size, colors, and location of text boxes. So this is also known as the parent, and an instance is known as the child. And basically what this means is that the main component is going to be the main design element that you're going to refer to. And the instance is whatever you copy from that main. So for example, you have right here 3 components. You have the happy button, the sad button, the surprise button, and an instance is literally just a copy of the main component that you keep reusing throughout your design. And they're linked to the main component. So when we start demoing, I'll show you examples. It's much better to follow along and much easier for me to show you rather than talk about it. But basically pretend I copy over this happy instance from this main happy component. If I change the happy main component, it will also change the instance. And I'll go over this as we keep going along. And you could find your components in your assets panel. So if I go back to the file here, next to the layers panel here, if you click assets, it'll provide you with all your components. Local components are the components you have localized to the design file you're working in currently. So as you can see, when we start demoing over here, we already have a component called card. And if I click this, it'll take me straight to it. And also you could access components across your library, which is more global. So you could access components that you've used in other files. And if you're working in a huge design system, this is where it really comes into play. And when it is really helpful to rely on the assets panel to reuse certain components. An easier way to find components as well is the shortcut Shift-I. So if I go over here, lecture slides, Shift-I, it'll bring up this little panel and you could search what component you're using. So for example, pretend I'm trying to grab that weather card that I was referring to. I could type in card, click on this, and it'll refer me, okay, it's doing this. Oh, it brought it over here, which I don't need. But that is a quicker / easier way to bring out what components you need. So ways to use components. So basically, there are probably going to be 2 main ways that you're going to use components. And this is the first example. And this is to rely on a main component and then use its non-overridden instances throughout the design. So an example of this, as you can see, is this icon bar. So pretend I'm creating an app and I keep reusing these assets of not started and in progress, but I don't want to keep replicating these and changing them individually. I'll make them a component so I could keep using them and copying and pasting without having to worry about the inconvenience of worrying about a bunch of them. And as you can see, you have a non-started component right here, and an in progress component. And if you look at this bottom example, you're applying these components in two different pages. So you could imagine if you have a huge design file and you have tons of different pages, this is when it comes in handy, because you're going to be using the not started in a lot of examples, as well as the in progress example in a lot of different pages. And this will make a lot more sense when we do the demo. Don't worry about it. And the second way to use components is to use a component as a template. So this example differs from the last example because the last example you have, let me go back here. Nope. Yep. The not started and in progress. You're going to be using the not started and in progress components very often, repeatedly. But here, if you look over here, you have a bunch of events. You have American Civil Liberties Union, Girls Who Code, Emerald Isle Immigration Center. So these, you don't want these as saved components because you're not going to be relying on these titles exactly. So what you do is you make a main component. So here you have two component cards, a short organization name example, and then a long organization name. And then you keep copying different instances and changing the titles of them. And in this way, you don't have to keep going back and copying a bunch of these. You rely on these as templates and then keep using the same one over and over again. And yeah. And these are a few examples of how components are used a little more creatively. Up here, you have Catan board game pieces and each piece has been turned into a component that you can keep reusing and turning into instances. I think Ace last spring in his lecture of this, he brought up the example of like creating me characters. You could see that as using different components. We'll get into variants later, but you could think of when you add on different types of hairstyles, you could think of that as using different components and copying over slightly different variants of hairstyles, eyebrows, whatever, to build a me character. And I believe you might work on this a little down the line during this class, but right here, number 5, elements of an illustrated avatar maker. This uses components a lot and reusing certain assets to build an avatar of yourself. Okay, and then going into variants and how variants are used, sometimes it gets confusing. What are variants and what are components and when to use each one? Well, basically variants are a way of grouping components that have similar purposes with only minor differences. So if you can imagine, pretend you have to make this label button, but you have to make 16 different versions of it. This is when a variant would be most useful for this. Because if you think about it, if you look at how many different states are active here, you have a default state, a hover state, a focus state, and a disable state. It would be a complete pain in the ass to keep having to manually adjust each of these, changing the shade of red, text, adding another little vector icon right here. So variants are a really easy way of switching in between all these different states in like an instant. And it's very intuitive and it's very easy to use. And it's a very intuitive when you're especially working on a design file where you have to switch between multiple states very often. And a real-time example of this is if you look up at this top bar, you could already see how these states are kicking into action. You have the default option here, but once you hover, you see that the shade changes here. So pretend I'm making a wireframe of Figma, then I would want variants to make sure I have these at hand to use instead of having to manually adjust and create them over and over again. And to create a group of variants from components, this example is pretty straightforward to follow. You have individual components, so you make each of these a button label that's a default, the hover, the focus, and disabled option. And you could see there's a naming system that comes with this. So I'll show examples of this in the demo, but if you title each one with button, which is the main name, and then you put a slash and then an individual name assigned to each different state. Once you turn all of these into like a family of variants, the entire card or family of system of variants will be called button. And then once you're switching in between every variant, it will follow whatever name you gave it after the slash. So for example, if I was using this button label, it'd be called default, and then I could easily switch it by clicking the hover option. Next. And in terms of adjusting and swapping variants, I will show an example of this soon. But basically, you this example, it's kind of hard to see, but you toggle using the right sidebar. There's a little option right here, and you'll see all your different states. And once you click on it, it automatically switches to whatever variant you made previously. And then this is actually a recent feature in Figma that came out, I believe, component properties. I won't be running through this as much because it's very complicated and there's a lot to components and variants that you guys are being exposed to right now. But this just came out. It's a more advanced way to customize and utilize component elements that are more specific and that are displayed in the design tab. I'm not even sure if I played around with this option yet. Let me see. But basically the three properties of component properties are text, Boolean, and swap instance. And these are just additional options to play around with text, as well as toggle like the opacity or the visibility of a certain element you're using. I probably won't show an example of this, but if you are interested, you could ask staff more questions about it or dig into the slides a bit more. And also, I think Figma released a blog file about all about how it works exactly and when to use it and such. Okay, sweet. So I'm gonna go through the demo now about how to create a component, when to use a component, and also when to create a variant. So if you want to follow along or watch, I'll head over to the demo space here, and we're gonna create a component of this weather card. And if you're thinking about, pretend I'm trying to create a weather app and have a ton of different screens and examples of what this weather app could look like on a design file. And I find myself using this specific like set of elements here with the text and the little bubble here. This is when you're going to want to create a component. So I'm going to create this right now. I'll place it in this frame for visibility purposes. I'm just going to eyeball it here. I'm going to create a rectangle right here. That looks about right. I'm going to use the eyedropper tool to copy this color. And then I'll go into each of these. I'll steal each of these properties. So I like kept clicking. And now when I type here, I should be able to type with the same properties here. So Berkeley, California. I'll steal the cloudy properties. I'm not copying anything, by the way. I'm literally just clicking. And then it saves those properties next time I want to use it. So cloudy. And then let me steal. That looks about right. 256. And then copy this cloud. Right here. And then I'll also round these corners out on the rectangle to make it more like some kind of widget. So I'll set the corners to 5. And that looks pretty decent. So now I have all these different elements and I want to make this reusable. So how do you create a component? I'm going to highlight all of these elements. And then if you go to the middle top bar right here, there's an icon like with 4 little diamonds and it says create component. You're going to click that and this will be highlighted in purple. So when you're highlighting different elements to know whether it's a variant, a component, or just a regular element, these are just regular elements. They're not assigned to anything yet. And you could tell because when you hover over them, it's surrounded by a light blue stroke. But once you create a component, this will be a solid purple stroke. So now we have a component here and you could delineate this and if you look here, you'll have the 4 little diamond. It's like a fancy diamond icon. Once I copy this down, now I have an instance. So look at this here now. I have component 5. This is my main component or the parent. And then the instance, which I just copied from the main component, is now in this hollow diamond shape here. So the cool thing is, pretend I like used a bunch of these. Like, let's just put them everywhere here. So these are all instances, right? And one day I decide I want the color of the icon to not be gray anymore, but like red, for example. That's not realistic really, but let's just pretend. And think about how annoying it would be to click every single one of these icons and manually change the red. This is where components are super useful. So I only have to change the main component and then those changes will be reflected in every instance. So let me change this here. I'll change the fill to red. boom. And then everything is now changed to the color you needed it to be. So this is why, oh wait, this is still like a weird shade. This is why components are so useful. And you could also override instances. This is another important feature of components and playing around with mains versus instances. So there might be times when you only want to change one of these instances. And this is when this comes in handy. So let me change these. So these three are instances. This is the main. Pretend I want this to no longer be 56, but I want it to be 58. The thing is, once you override an instance, if you try changing the parent to reflect the same changes in all the instances, it will do it for these bottom two because I didn't touch those instances, but it won't change the one I just overrode. So if I do this 60, you could see that the bottom two changed, but this one didn't. So this one will stay static as it is. So these. And yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm. Sorry, could you say that one more time a little louder?
So like you have the 56 and like the 58, right? And
yeah.
Changing the text, then like let's say you change the parent and make it red. Does the red change reflect in the instance?
No. So let's try this. So I'm overwriting this right now. I do this to 60. And then if I change, you're asking if I change this, will it also change the 60 to the red color?
Yeah.
It will not. Oh, it will. Okay, I'm wrong. So this is where Figma gets a little finicky because I think when they're design components and instances, they're keeping in mind of different properties that will switch when you override and some that will not switch when you override. So for example, when you make an instance, you cannot change the placement of the specific elements in an instance. So if you see this right here, I'm trying to move this cloud more to the center, but I just can't. And the reason for this is because I think intuitively when Figma was designing components, it doesn't really make sense when you're creating a reusable component to also just keep changing individual things in the instances. So they want to keep that consistent. But they do know that you might want to switch things like color or the specific text placeholders that are active. So I guess I was wrong. And yes, you could override the color, but not the text. So this is something that's just good to play around with. And as you keep designing and using components, you'll see what makes sense when you're changing instances, overriding instances and such. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sweet, yeah. And then I'll show you something else as well. If I remember this correctly, let me delete these. Create another instance here. Pretend, let me change the background color to yellow again. Pretend I have like, I actually want the main parent to be changed to this yellow color as well. But I'm just like in a giant file and I just don't want to worry about finding this main component one more time. If you right/double click, you could go all the way down here to main component. And if you push changes to the main component, it will switch what you did to the instance. So as you can see, there's a lot of different options and things you could do with components and instances. And it's just best to keep playing around with these different options and see what works best, especially, and it'll really come to use. You'll start to really get it once you're putting these to use. I think, yeah, go for it. I believe not. Let's try. See. This one red. Let's push the changes. Wait. Okay, why is this not? Oh, it does. Okay, so I'm wrong again. So I guess this is another instance of convenience. And when you do want to change everything without having to refer directly to the main component, this would help. As you can see, I guess I'm a little rusty in terms of the rules when it comes to components and instances. So yeah. Does anyone have any more questions before I go into when to turn this into a variant? Okay, sweet. And then Ace also mentioned this. It's like, oh, when do you know when to use components, instances, variants? It's not like you open a file and like, oh, I'm going to use components right now. It's more like as you're going along with your work, you'll realize you keep using something over and over again. And then you'll realize, okay, I should turn this element into a component. So it just makes my life easier. So yeah. I believe this is like steps to start making a variant, but it's a little outdated. So I'm going to show you another method right now. So if I click on my component here and I'm realizing that I want multiple different states of this very similar layout. For example, not only do I want a cloudy weather icon, but now I want a rainy icon and a sunny icon. This is when variants come into play and when you could switch between these different options very easily. So I'll have this and then I'll click this button up here, add variant. And you could see what it does is it makes like a little family of variants. So now I have this variant, and I want to add one more. And if you want to add one more variant, if you hover over this family, click on it, you'll see this little plus icon. It'll give you one more right below. So I'm going to go ahead and start making changes to make 3 different variants. So I'll change this to rainy. I'll steal this little rain icon. I'll copy this over here. And then maybe I'll change the weather to 35 degrees. And then I want this to be sunny. Change this to sunny. I'll make this like 90 degrees. I'll get rid of this cloud and replace it with the sun. So now you have these different variants that come into play, and the convenience of this, for example, is let me pretend I'm using this cloudy variant. And if you click on it, you could see down here, component 5, you can now switch between your options. So, okay, I should have done this before. It's very important to also label your variants. So let me just change these real quickly. Actually, this naming could be a little finicky sometimes. Just let me... Property 1, I'll do this cloudy. Property 2, I'll do this rainy. Yeah, because it doesn't help if you have like 10 different variants or 20 different variants and they're all labeled variant 1 through 20. That's really confusing. So, and I'll change this to sunny. So if I click on this and I go to my right hand, I'll have cloudy, but I want sunny. So I'll click this and it'll immediately switch that. So you could see how this is really nice to have when you're using an element that has a similar purpose, but you need a bunch of little iterations throughout that you know you'll be using throughout your project. And when it comes to this weather app, you're going to want a lot of different states when it comes to weather. So you're going to be switching between a bunch of different examples without having to keep copying and pasting and individually changing weather icons and such like that. And I'll show you a very simple example of another way to make variants with these colored squares. So 10, I have a red square here. And then I'll have a blue square. And I'll also have a yellow square. You could highlight all of these. And then if you go up here, the immediate option is not create variant because you haven't made a component yet. You can only make a variant once it's a component. So if you go down here and you create a component set, now you have variants. So I'll name this. Okay, I forgot to rename these again. I'm sorry. Red square. Square. Blue square. And then here, yellow square. So that's another way to do that. And as you can see, if I copy this over, oh, I don't want to use yellow anymore, I'll switch this over to blue, or I'll switch this over to red. And yeah, That's another way to do that. And that's a very basic example of how to create a component from scratch and then turn that component into a system of variants and be able to cycle through those very easily. Did that make sense to everyone? That was the demo. I don't know if I went too fast or anything, but sweet. Okay, then. This is a long lecture, so I'm gonna do a quick 5-minute break, just to chill, restroom break or whatever, and then after that, we'll go into the rest of the content. So let's regroup at 6:11. Oh, okay, sweet. So it's 6:11, so we'll hop back into lecture and I'll start going over, okay, questions, yeah. Other useful tools in Figma. We're going to go over smart selection, grids and guides and constraints. And these are basically just additional tools that are going to help you with composition, organization, margins, and basically ties into components in terms of making sure your design files are very organized and easy to use. So we'll start with smart selection, which is like a very genius tool and a very useful tool to use in Figma. And this is a way to quickly arrange and rearrange elements without, okay, it's doing that. Okay, is that the right slide? There we go. So when you're working with a big file, especially, you're probably going to have to deal with a lot of different elements. You're going to be rearranging a lot of different elements all the time. And it might be very difficult to keep having to manually align things and switch different element locations. So this is when smart selection comes into play. And this is an example of adjusting spacing. Pretend you want to adjust the spacing of multiple elements without having to do it one by one. This is where this tool comes into play. And how this works is you basically drag handles between multiple elements, and I'll show you that right now. So let's take these squares, for example. Pretend I want this to, right now, I want it to look more like this. But imagine if I had like 10 of these squares and I kept having to move them one by one till they're all equally spaced. An easy way to do this is highlight all these squares and you'll see these little pink guides come up. What you're going to do is click one of these little pink lines and you could adjust the spacing in this way. So pretend I was originally at 13, I believe, or 14, whatever. And then I want to extend this to like 30. You could do that, and that is a really easy way of adjusting spacing of multiple elements without having to manually adjust them. Next example is reordering objects. So I believe this is very helpful when we actually make the slide decks for this decal in Figma, because we'll be wanting to swap around the order of certain slides, but it's really annoying when you have like a 60 slide lecture and it's a real headache to do that without the help of the smart selection. So imagine I want to change the blue and the yellow. I'll highlight all these objects and I could drag these by holding this pink circle. So I want yellow first, and these will snap into place, as you can see. So pretend I want to move this over here. It won't like snap somewhere else. It'll specifically go to the space it's supposed to fill. You could see that right there. So that's also a super useful tool. And then finally, the other thing smart selection does is resizing multiple objects at once. And how you do that is you're going to use the same pink circle that I mentioned before. So I'll highlight all these objects. If I click this one and then I hold shift and I click yellow, pretend I only want to change the shape of the yellow and the red squares. I'll have both of these highlighted. As you can see, this one's like an empty pink circle. These are filled. And then I'll start dragging these down like that. Or I could do, I believe if I hold command instead of shift, I could click specific elements that I want to move. So red and blue, for example, and then I'll just move these. And you can see how the spacing is still maintained as well. So yeah, that's the smart selection tool. Next is grids and guides. So this is really important for alignment, and it helps a lot when you're working within a frame and you just have a hard time lining specific elements with each other, whether you're dealing with like a mix of components and text and you need everything to be like pixel perfect, this is when grids and guides kick into play. So these are two tools that can be used to help you align objects, keeping spacing in mind. Guides are lines that you can drag out to where you want, and that'll help you align things. It does a similar thing to the smart selection tool where elements will snap to the grid lines that you assign it to. And then the layout grids help align objects within a frame along a custom grid. And I'll show you examples of how that works. As you can, in this example, these are examples of the layout grids. So it looks kind of like a checkered pattern. And there's a lot of customization options when it comes to using those guides. So this is how guides work. They're helpful in marking a line where you want to align objects and allows those objects to snap into place. Show an example of this. Let's pretend I'll pull up the ruler guide. So if you shortcut Shift R, that'll bring up the ruler right here. And then if I start dragging out from either of the axes, you'll see I have these pop up. And then I want this right here. So pretend I want this family of variants for some reason to line up like top left. I'll adjust these guides like right here. And then you can see while I start dragging this, it'll snap right into place there. And then if you want to get rid of those guidelines, you could either hide them by pressing Shift R and you'll be back to your normal default state. Or if you want to get rid of them entirely, you just drag them all the way up where they came from and they will disappear. Next example are the layout grids. And this allows for consistency across your designs. I believe if I go over to the lecture sides, you could see how crazy these layout grids can get. Yeah, so sometimes it could be a little overkill. You could see we applied like a custom layout grid to all of these to make sure there's consistency in all the slides in terms of layout and the way all the objects are oriented, and making sure that everything's aligned and organized correctly. And you could toggle this off again by pressing Shift G. And these layout grids, they could be applied only to a frame. So let me click on this frame here. And on the right sidebar, you'll see layout grid. If I press the plus, the default layout grid is a 10 by 10 grid. You can see it looks like a sheet of graph paper. But what usually comes in more handy are using columns and rows instead. So if I click on the settings here, I have my default grid here, but if I click this, I could change this to a column. And you can see now I have like customization options. Pretend I want the count of columns to be 8 instead of 5. And then if I press plus again, I could change this grid to rows. And I'll change this to 8 for consistency. And now I have a layout grid that I customized to be split into specific rows and columns. And you could also, this is getting a little more advanced and fancy with it, but you could adjust like how these grids are aligned. Depending on which setting you choose, it'll change when you shift the frame. So I think stretch, you can see it stretches along with that. But if I do top, those rows will be aligned to the top and it'll only stay at the top even when you resize the frame like that. So a lot of options there. And let me just get rid of these. And those are layout grids. And I just went over this. Grid properties. I think I just went over this as well. Okay. And I believe the last one we have here are constraints. And this is making sure your designs always resize the right way. So what happens to content if we resize it? You can see in this example here that this Kingpin Donuts website, I might want this icon to scale and get bigger as I extend this frame, but it's not doing that. And all these other elements are not moving as well. So you can see how there can be complications when you need to, for example, change the resolution of a frame and you need to make it bigger, but these elements are not working well. This is when constraints come into play. So what are constraints? They do exactly what they sound like. They constrain elements into certain positions or spots. So these are different constraint options. And basically, when you're playing around with the different constraint settings of where you want a specific element to be placed when you're resizing a frame, that element will expand or stay in a certain position no matter how you play with that frame. A little confusing when I say it like that, but to show you an example, let me press this family of variants. And you can see you have your constraints panel right here. Right now, I think the default is left top. So if I move this, if I adjust the size of this frame from the left top, it will stay at the left top. And when I move it from the bottom right, it won't move anymore because it's constrained to the left top. But if I change this to right bottom, when I change this frame, it won't move as last time. But when I start shifting the shape of the frame from the right bottom, it will stay in that position. And so you could see though, pretend I want to, when I enlarge the size of this frame, I also want to enlarge the scale of my variance. Then you would want to hit the scale option. And in this way, when you extend the frame, you could see that gets bigger. Okay, obviously this is like a little glitchy because it's a family, but if you imagine like a normal element, like a circle in a frame, the circle will get a lot bigger. So frame here, circle here. You could see the default is left top, as I said before. So if I move left top, moving like that, but once I put scale options on the constraints, this will get bigger. So those are how constraints work. Any questions about any of the three tools I just went over? Sweet. Okay, and then now we're no longer going over specific tools, but now we're going to go over more like different design principles that you can utilize once you're used to using these tools. So composition and spacing, we'll be going over visual hierarchy, how to create it, spacing grids, and more. Creating visual hierarchy, this is one of like my favorite topics to like practice and put into use, and also see examples of how other like designers use this in practice. This applies a lot to the last lecture I taught as well, and how important color and typography are when you're trying to establish visual hierarchy. You could look at this example up here, this newspaper, and you could obviously see what is trying to compete for your attention. So you have the headline, which obviously is in this very thick, bolded font that says "On the Moon." That should most likely immediately grab your attention. And then they hope to have the viewer look at the subheading, the picture, and then hopefully read the small text. And especially when you're designing UI, it's really important to start practicing what focal points you're trying to have your audience look at, because that could lead them to certain calls to action and emphasize certain important information that you might not be able to do if you don't understand how your design system is looking visually. This is another example of ways to create visual hierarchy. As I talked about before, color is super important on the top left, but also reading patterns are super important. As you could see this example on the right with the Apple shopping page, you have this kind of traditional way of looking at this page from like right to left, but you also zigzag down. So you're viewing these products from left to right, and then you see the headline of calling all pros, and then you have the buy option. So there's different things competing for your attention, but there's also a very neutral layout with the grays and the blacks being used, and then these different like this computer screen that has like this crazy color coordination or color combination happening that's also calling your attention to buy the laptop. So quickly going over Gestalt principles. Principles is spelled wrong, my bad. But these are basically general guidelines to follow when it comes to how different visual design elements are kind of perceived. These are not specific rules that should exactly be followed, but these were more created to kind of understand why people view things and how they group things and take mental shortcuts to understand visual stimuli. So you could see on the top left example here, it's a Dalmatian dog, but like technically it's not. It's more just like a bunch of different dots and patterns, and your brain pieces it to look like a dog. I'm pretty sure you guys have seen this before as well. Like you could either see this as some kind of like object or the two faces facing each other. So our brain has different ways of taking mental shortcuts when it comes to understanding exactly what we're looking at. And we could use and try to look at these different principles to improve our designs. So running through some of the principles kind of generally, we have proximity. Obviously, elements that are closer to each other will most likely associate them as being being related to each other. And common region is also similar. Elements that are placed within the same region, they're perceived as group. So I could imagine like if a bunch of people are grouped at one table, they're most likely friends because they chose to choose that one table versus spreading out and sitting individually at a bunch of other tables. You have similarity. You could take a card deck as an example. You have suits as well as black and red colors that are helping delineate what card you should put down. You have closure. You could think of the FedEx logo as like a prime example of how closure is used. You could see that arrow in between the letters. And with this IBM letter, it really is just like a bunch of blue lines, but your brain is piecing it to spell those letters. And then you have continuation, which are when elements are just arranged in a line or in a certain order, your brain will naturally follow the order of how those things should be perceived, as you can see with these icons. And then going over spatial and grid systems. So I know this is something that like Ace is very, very like passionate about / thinks is very, very important. So spatial and grid systems is basically key to organizing your spacing to making your designs look great. You could imagine if you don't have a great spatial and grid system, your elements just look off. You imagine using like the Postmates app and the spacing is a little different for every single restaurant. It would just be off-putting and it's not very trustworthy to look at because there's no real consistency that you're sensing in the app. And why these grids are so helpful, you'll be applying like spacing and margin techniques when you're making different designs. And when you're tackling on a huge like design project, it's not very wise to just like eyeball and keep arranging elements in like a slightly random order like I did, for example, for the demo. When you're doing something more comprehensive, it's better to rely on a system like this. And you could see there's no clear vertical rhythm here. These elements are like weirdly placed next to each other, but here it's utilizing an 8-point spatial system. And you could see that these are spaced according to groups of 8. So you have 24, 16, 32, and 32. And you could see how this looks a lot more reliable than this. These are like scrunched up and it's spaced apart, but these have an actual system and order in place. And then defining spatial systems. So basically it's ill-advised to kind of rely on odd numbers like 3 or 5 when it comes to spatial systems, and very reliable to rely on more even numbers. I think 4, 8, and 6 are like the general go-tos when it comes to developing a spatial system for your designs. But this is also kind of subjective. So you could think about your Gmail layout and how all your emails file in. I think there's an option. There's like 3 different options for how kind of scrunched and compacted you want your emails to come in. You could have like really cramped email, Gmail, or like a really like spaced out Gmail. Maybe it's like too overwhelming when you have a really cramped Gmail. So that's something to keep in mind when you're defining a spatial system, especially understanding like your users and your audience when you're developing something, and keeping in mind what you might want to apply in terms of like the padding or the height of different elements. And then types of grids, again, Figma is like very, very, there's a lot of different options that Figma gives you when it comes to grids. You have a column grid, allowing you to organize content into vertical columns easily. You have a modular grid, uses rows and columns for a matrix grid structure. Obviously, this is like getting a little more advanced, but it's just a prime example of when you're starting to develop a system, when you're using components, variants, you have a very streamlined way of choosing and organizing all your different elements. And then the last topic for today is ideation and wireframing. And this is basically trying to bring your ideas to life and understanding how to go about doing that. So what is wireframing and why is it important? When you're starting out, pretend I'm designing a weather app again. You're not sure what it looks like. You don't want to jump right into the final product and start immediately making things look really pretty, assigning different colors, because jumping right into a final product is ill-advised, because imagine you have a bunch of different ideas you also want to apply. So wireframing is a great way to work through these different ideas, and there's 3 different stages that you'll go through until you kind of reach your final design. So you could see here what I talked about before is experimenting with different ideas. So wireframes are basically your designs that you're trying out at different stages. They're sometimes referred to as prototypes, but they compose of different fidelities, low, mid, and high fidelity. And it allows you to be super flexible in terms of the development of how your design system is going to turn out to look like. So what is fidelity? Ace made a great comparison of like low fidelity. If you think of like lo-fi music, like lo-fi study beats, it kind of has like this like not amateur, I'm not thinking of the right word, like you could hear like the crackly sound in the back. It's like lo-fi. So it's similar to this instance where it's a little more stripped down. You could see this left example here, you have your general layout, but none of these are exactly finalized. You have all these different names for lotions or scents, I believe. And then you have filler text, but you have a headline and you have a delineated like photo under that text. But then when you move on and you finally develop that into a high fidelity version, you have your chosen text or your typeface. You have all these products filled in, and you have names and a product photo. So you could see how organically you're developing your design from like an initial sketch to a final product. Here's another example of low to mid to high. Obviously, this is subjective. The lines between what is low, mid, and high is a little blurry. Low and mid can sometimes blend into each other. For example, this is like kind of like an iPad sketch, for example, of how you want these specific elements to look like. Your mid fidelity version would be transferring that over to Figma and creating those components and creating a rough layout of how everything should look. And then your high fidelity is the closest to your final product that you'll get. You see you have like a gradient fill working here. You have your typeface chosen. You have your button like finalized, probably with other variants ready to go as well. So it's just a much smoother and organic way of doing this instead of jumping right into what you think is like the best option for a design. And I went into this already. Here's another example. You have filler filled in and then more final. Does anyone have any questions about those things I just talked about? Sweet. Okay, well, this is wrap up. That's basically lecture for this week. Just some quick announcements. Your next assignment is going to be making Spotify. This is one of my favorite assignments in the entire lecture. You're basically going to be kind of making low, mid, and high fidelity profiles, and then also using components and variants to make like different playlists and such. So like different profile photos and such like that, if I remember that correctly. So definitely like a great use of everything I just talked about. Your lab this week, it's very heavy on a variance, but it's done in a more creative way. So you'll be playing around with different patterns, creating those from scratch, and also creating your own unique pattern by switching between different variants. So that'll be this Thursday with your TA. Okay, this is always glitching out. And then, okay. The secret word is backpack for today. And then make sure to do the readings as well. And I went over everything else, I believe. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for coming out to lecture. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up to me or Katie. And yeah, have a great week. And also, no lecture on Monday since it's President's Day, but I believe there will be a recorded lecture uploaded that day. Thank you. Secret word.